What an incredible geographic diversity. I'm loving this.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. As Jason was saying, a beautiful, diverse audience from all over the world. So welcome to this WISE Learning Ecosystems Living Lab panel. This is our second panel on how can cities nurture learning. I am Sebastian Turbo. I'm based in Montreal, Canada, and I am the co-founder and chief strategist of Eco6, a consultancy helping communities, businesses, and cities design and develop innovation and learning ecosystems. I am also currently a research fellow for WISE and leading the Learning Ecosystems Living Lab, and hence my presence here today as your moderator. So again, welcome everyone. With the Learning Ecosystems Living Lab, what we're trying to do is to mobilize practitioners, experts, policymakers, innovators, teachers, and learners as a global community of practice and as a design hub on learning ecosystems. Now, often in discussions and debates around designing learning ecosystems, many of these conversations focus on crucial and key elements of these ecosystems, such as stakeholder engagement, stakeholder mapping, leadership, governance, collaboration models, pedagogies of these learning ecosystems, new forms of assessment and of credentializing learning and teaching. But for us at WISE and at the Living Lab, it is equally important to ask how learners relate and engage with the physical and digital space that surrounds them. Hence, today's panel on cities and learning, and the key question we want to ask today: how do we redesign our cities and our public spaces in order to maximize learning opportunities for all? Indeed, what can the learning ecosystems movement learn from other urban or education-related movements, such as the smart city conversation, the placemaking, the playful learning, or again, the child-friendly cities conversation? To discuss this with me today, I have the pleasure and honor of being joined by four amazing global experts and leaders on these questions: Jay Deshmukh, Helen Hadani, Jason Twill, and Professor Carlos Moreno. I'll quickly introduce these four panelists to you. Jay, as a project and design lead at IBI's Global Learning Plus studio, you lead the design, strategic thinking, and planning for education projects with a strong focus on place-centric design. You bring to today's conversation over 20 years of experience in education design solutions, and you have worked on the design and the planning of a wide variety of education and learning spaces around the world, including Canada, the US, Turkey, India, Pakistan, and Dubai. You are also currently working on a design research on the post-pandemic campus and on future-focused campus planning and design. Helen, you are a fellow of the Center for Universal Education and the Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking at the Brookings Institutions. You are an expert in early childhood and creativity development. You conduct research on the benefits of playful learning in both formal and informal context. You've spent 20 years in research and education settings, applying your knowledge of early childhood development and innovative pedagogies to develop creative learning experiences for both children and their families. You have also, amongst many things, consulted for toy, technology, and media companies, including the Walt Disney Company, Sesame Workshop, Apple, Lego, Hasbro, Fisher-Price, and Mattel. Jason, with a career spanning over 20 years in urban development, you have, if I understand, in various capacities been at the forefront of the transformation of our built environment. You are a recognized pioneer in innovation districts, alternative housing, and regenerative urbanism. Currently, you are director of the World Cup Master Program at Qatar Foundation in Doha, where you are leading the foundation's sustainability and legacy objectives in hosting the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Education City, Qatar Foundation's home campus, and also the home of one of the stadiums of the World Cup. Finally, Professor Carlos Moreno, you are the scientific director of the Entrepreneurship, Territory, Innovation at the University of Panthéon-La Sorbonne, IAE in Paris, France. You are a globally recognized innovative mind and pioneer on the future of cities. You have notably developed and strongly advocate in favor of the concepts of the human smart city, the 15-minute city, and the 30-minute territory. You are also a scientific advisor of national and international figures and institutions, including a role as the mayor of Paris's special envoy for smart city. You are the author of Urban Life and Proximity at the time of COVID-19 that you recently published in July 2020 with Les Éditions de l'Observatoire. On the 15-minute city concept you've recently released in November of 2020 with the same publisher, Droit de Cité, de la ville-monde à la ville du quart d'heure, an amazing read soon to be available in English and in Spanish on the 15-minute city. Thanks to the four of you for being here. Thank you to our audience as well for being here. Before we dive into the conversation, just a little bit of housekeeping to say that we wanted to make today's panel a bit more interactive and engaging and participatory. So there won't be a dedicated panel session and a dedicated question and answer session. We will be inviting you to share your questions, your comments, your thoughts directly in the chat box in your Zoom screen. Please indicate your name and eventually where you're from, and we will be taking your questions and your comments as we go. Also, finally, don't hesitate to share today's conversation on your networks and on social media. If you wish to do so, don't hesitate to use the hashtag #WiseLivingLab and the hashtag #LearningCities. And that's all for the housekeeping. Let's take a deep dive into a conversation. And I'd like to start with a very broad question on what the four of you think, what role can cities and urban design play in fostering community-based learning environments and spaces? Do you feel that cities and neighborhoods are delivering on this potential? And how does this link to your work? Maybe Jay, maybe I can start with you. How are you?
I'm well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here with such an excellent group of colleagues. I think what's become really interesting as a response to your question is that we think about what the word community means to start with, what learning means. I think all of these words, how they come together has dramatically been changed in our minds over the past year. And I think that even before this pandemic has hit us, of course, cities have been considering what their role is in the knowledge economy for a very long time. And this kind of intersection between formal and informal networks that stretch across cities and indeed across regions really has been discussed for a very long time. I think what makes the conversation more interesting now, in a sense, is to define what public space is. You know, what is the public realm? I have no doubt that we will go into that conversation quite a bit with everybody here, because there is, you know, I'm just looking at, you know, the number of places people are calling in from. And I think this definition of the public realm, even the perception of what defines public, is fairly different from one part of the world to the other. So I'm actually looking forward to a really interesting conversation. The simple answer is some cities have always been doing really well at it and are only going further. But I think that this conversation is now ever present in the minds of pretty well every city, but also every citizen. So I think that it's both a kind of a ground up consciousness as well as one that's coming down. So I think that I'll leave it at that for now.
And indeed, we'll be curious to dig deeper into what you think are the cities that are doing better than others. But maybe, Jason, can I invite you to comment on this question on the role that cities can play in maximizing learning opportunities?
I think first and foremost, if you're going to have a community-based outcome, you should have the community involved. I think we're challenged in the urban age we're in now is predominantly dominated and market-driven. And you have this phenomenon of metropolitan pressure and that constant competition for land, be it for recreation, school, housing, office, whatever it might be, or retail, pushes the industry to focus on highest and best use, which is really highest value use. So the value being more monetary versus community-based value. So I see a tension between that, and where cities are doing it really well is where they start with the community first, and the community has a very strong voice in working with the government or working with developers or the private sector to really help shape a vision of the public domain in their city or their community. Even with teenagers and kids being involved in that dialogue is so important for how they're going to engage and use the public domain and what kind of outcomes we create for them. I think it's really important. So I see this emergence of community-led development happening around the world in some European cities that are doing really well in this, the cooperative movements in the Europe. But by and large, it's been piecemeal. Some cities are excellent at it, and some cities are still have a long way to go. But you're still in this kind of very commodified urban environment right now, which is creating a lot of problems. And what's great is that where there's, New York had 30% of its retail vacant because of this issue of pressure and not being able to afford unless you have franchise retail. But there's amazing cities that have gone through industrial to service sector transition where community have backfilled those spaces by creating artists and local businesses can incubate and fill those spaces. And a lot of them are for youth engagement and youth development for stuff outside of school, so they can learn apprenticeship with local businesses. And there's stories around that, like Newcastle in Australia is a great example of a downtown that's reinvented itself because of, a big industrial anchor like a steel mill left the city decimated, but it backfilled because the community came together and did it in partnership with council. So it's community-led outcomes. So I think there's a really good tension, but there's an emergence of a new way of thinking about our cities for more equitable and inclusion around the way community is involved and how they shape their own place.
Well, and we'll be coming back to the community and equity conversation later. But maybe Helen, what are kind of your initial thoughts around this broad question around the cities and learning?
Yeah, I mean, I really love a lot of what Jason and Jay have brought up with community involvement. And yeah, I think we'll get more into that later, but just talking a little bit more from sort of the education child development perspective, I think we've seen, in the past year with the pandemic has made it even more apparent that we need to have a wider range of opportunities, learning, enrichment opportunities for children and families. School is now not a given. Kids going to school, just before we started the webinar, we were all talking about how some of our kids are going back to school, some are coming back home, and it's, this, back and forth a lot. So having some stability in terms of bringing education into the public realm and having those opportunities available at any time, whether kids are going to school or not. And so, this is particularly true for children living in under-resourced and marginalized communities, that these equity gaps in education are just getting bigger and wider. And so we have this opportunity in cities and in every area. It doesn't only have to be in metropolitan areas, but we know that more and more families are living in cities and having young children. It's stressful. It's stressful for parents to live in a city with young children. It's not built. Many cities are not built for young children. It's hard to get around. Mobility is an issue. Transportation, accessing, having a safe place to play are issues that shouldn't be. And so thinking, one innovative approach for bringing education to the public realm is around playful learning. These are, child-led activities that are often initiated or directed by an adult or caretaker. And I think a little bit later, I'll share more about one specific initiative that's part of my work at Brookings is Playful Learning Landscapes. And so I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, well, we'll come to that indeed in a few minutes. Professor Moreno, this question of cities and learning, eventually how it links to your concept of the 15-minute city. I mean, how much is learning part of that concept? How do you add to that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here with this amazing worldwide community. Greeting from Paris for all. Indeed, the 15-minute city concept, it is a concept in order to improve the quality of life of citizen dwellers. And we wanted to maximize all kinds of opportunities for living in this low carbon proximity. Why? Because today, we have been living cities with two greatest challenges. On the one hand, climate change, and on the other hand, the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. In our model for proposing this urban proximity, we have created a new urban model based on 6 key urban social functions: to live, to work, to supply, to care, to educate. This is the topic of today, and to enjoy. We consider that we need to change our urban lifestyle. We need to propose a new paradigm if we want to shift towards a new low carbon urban life. And for that, the education is at the heart of this new paradigm. In the city of Paris, for example, the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, has decided in the framework of the 15-minute city to create a new program, the Climate Academy. What is the Climate Academy? The Climate Academy, this is a new open place for kids, for teenagers, in order to offer the free contact from teenagers, from kids, from young people with experts, activists, scientists, and different communities of scientists in order to develop this new paradigm and to propose the new interactive activities for considering the importance for changing. The 15-minute city, one of the first concrete measures for the city of Paris was to open the schools, the courtyard, during the weekend. Until now, from the whole history of the French Republic, the schools are closed at the weekend. And for the 15-minute city, if we wanted to develop a new commitment of citizens, if we want to develop a new commitment for parents, if we wanted to develop a new commitment for neighbors, we need to offer new urban spaces for discussing, for exchanging, for developing new activities. And it is easy to consider the quantity of square meters only in the schools during the weekend, totally empty. This first measure, of course, was a very important way for showing that we need to propose all kinds of urban spaces in order to develop the new contacts, the new possibility for formal or informal education. And this way of the 15-minute city, this is a way for offer a crisscross approach. We wanted to break with the vertical functionalities in cities, to live, to work, to care, to educate in each one of isolated places. We wanted to offer this concept of chronotopia, the possibility for dedicating for each one of our square meters multiple activities, the multi-purpose function of each one of the square meters. And it is possible to transform every square meters for developing the urban life, including education, including culture. We need to propose this way for spreading education and culture in all kinds of districts. We need to break with the vision of a specialized campus. We need to offer each one of the square meters available for educating, available for learning, and available for exchanging, for mixing, and to develop all kinds of social interactions. In fact, educate and learn in cities is before all a social interaction. And we need today to fight against racism, against populism, against social exclusions. To offer the 15-minute city, this is the way for offering this social mixing in the proximity, for rediscovering our resources, for rediscovering the proximity, and if we wanted to put it in a nutshell, for rediscovering our humanity in each one of the square meters, in each one of the streets, in each one of the squares, in each one of places of the city. The humanity is today the key for opening towards new horizons in cities.
I like that very much, Professor Moreno. I like your idea indeed of breaking down, the vertical functionalities of cities, and you were talking about transforming each of our urban spaces into potential learning spaces. On that, I'd like us to look into the fact that apparently in recent years, and I'll turn to you, Helen, in a second, there's been really major improvements and research being done, in the neurosciences and the social sciences, in understanding how, as humans, we interact and engage with the physical space, and how we can learn from that. Can I maybe start with you, because I think this is really at the core of the work of your work, on how, looking at what neurosciences and social sciences tell us about how we engage with space and how we learn from space.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sebastian. And loves so much of what Carlos was just saying about thinking about, multiple outcomes. At every square meter of a city, we should be thinking about, learning and caretaking and businesses and sort of making vibrant cities. And if we're making them, learning experiences for children and families, that not only benefits them, it benefits everybody in the city. And that's sort of the core piece of what we're working on in an initiative that we call Playful Learning Landscapes. This is a collaboration between the Brookings Institution and Temple University, researchers at Temple University. So this is a project that's based in the developmental sciences, on research and developmental psychology, showing, yes, that the environment has a huge impact. The environment, not only in terms of the built environment, but the people in that environment. So considering the environment to be both social and the built environment. And we know that especially in early childhood, that sets the trajectory for children's learning, having a caring, nurturing environment for children in which they feel safe, not only propels their learning, but changes the wiring of their brain in order to learn. And so I'll just share quickly, just to show a little bit of what Playful Learning Landscapes is. It's a little easier to show it rather than describe. And so here you see a project we call Urban Thinkscape. So the basis of Playful Learning Landscapes is sort of marrying developmental science with placemaking. So taking, sort of core foundational findings from developmental science about how children learn, about how we all learn as humans, and embedding that in the built architecture. And so Urban Thinkscape, just to take an example, is a project in West Philadelphia, where it was a collaboration with researchers, architects, urban designers. The community played a big part in this, was part of it from beginning to end in helping to design the space, where the space was going to be located, and then even collecting some of the data to evaluate the space. And so in Urban Thinkscape, what you find is activities and structures that are promoting what we call executive function, planning, memory skills, self-control in young children, which are very powerful predictors for children's success in academics and beyond. Their language skills, literacy, storytelling, spatial skills as well. And so what we see from this project is that you have these activities and structures, and data collected in this space has shown that compared to a control space, another space in this, another play area in a similar neighborhood, you see great increases in both the quality and quantity of caregiver-child interactions and language. So huge jumps in terms of what children and parents are talking about, in terms of talking more about numbers, about spatial relations, about letters, all these things that we know predict later learning in fields like STEM and spatial recognition and learning. And so we see from this that the built architecture can have an impact on children's learning. So to take the one example in the middle, we call that jumping feet. So that's sort of a twist on your typical childhood favorite hopscotch. So you see either 1 foot or 2 footprints on the stones, and there's signage near the game prompting children to put 1 foot where they see 2 and vice versa. So this is based on a very famous developmental psychology task, and where you're asking children to tap once, where you see someone else tap twice, and vice versa. And it forces sort of children to to pause, think about what they're doing before they act. So that promotes sort of flexible thinking and self-control. So that's just one example of, this is another photo of Urban Thinkscape. So it's basically taking an abandoned lot to a bus stop. So this used to be an abandoned lot next to a bus stop, and transforming it into an interactive play space to get families sort of, more engaged. And then just quickly, another example, in a supermarket.
I really like this one, Helen, please.
So for supermarket speak, so this is a different example. So here what we see is we're trying to meet families where they are, right? Where are families already spending time? Where are they waiting? Where families spend a lot of time waiting for the bus, waiting for the train, going to the supermarket. right? So I think parents out there, we all have, drag our kids to the supermarket, put them in the shopping cart. Those are opportunities for caregivers and children to talk about numbers, to talk about shapes, to talk about colors. And so here, this is a sort of simple intervention, putting up signs in the supermarket. So here you see the little boy looking in the bakery section, very enticing as to what he's wanting to get there. So putting up signs, how many rolls are in the basket, or in the dairy section, where does milk come from? Which is not so simple an answer these days. It could come from a cow, from a soybean, many from an almond, right? And so what researchers found, this research was done by researchers at Temple University, when the signs were up versus when they were down in supermarkets, and mainly in low-income neighborhoods, you find a huge jump, a 33% increase. And that's huge in terms of findings in developmental psychology. Very significant, huge increases in caregiver-child language interaction. Again, from an intervention that, you print the signs out on your computer and you put them up in the supermarket. It doesn't have to be fancy or expensive. And so this is another example of what we're talking about. To change a little bit of something in the environment can have a huge impact on caregiver-child interactions.
Helen, this is really amazing. Yeah, thank you for that. I want to maybe turn to Jason and Jay, because you're both urban planners and architects. You've both worked on many projects, urban development projects, education and learning spaces. How does this resonate with your work? How does this link between learning and space applies to your work and to your thinking? Typically, I'll start to you, Jay. The other day we were talking and you were telling me about, you're a strong believer in this concept of the forever kindergarten. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I'll start one step back, if I might. So what Helen is also sort of bringing up is, harkens back to this very foundational idea that certainly architects and designers and planners think about all the time, which is the environment is the third teacher. So this is an idea that Malaguzzi sort of introduced with the Reggio Emilio approach for early childhood education. And I was privileged as a graduate student far too many years ago to learn about it from one of the a professor in North Carolina who was very strongly doing research in the world of the two extremes, if you will. So early childhood education and aging in place. And to some of the points that have been made here, this notion that if the city is catering to the child, it is likely to be catering to most others. And I would stretch that to say, if the city is catering to the youngest and the oldest members of society, then we are likely to be paying attention to all those in between. And so if I might stretch that to today's conversation, I think there's a greater and greater understanding that learning is not merely in those sort of formal structures of school and university, which is not to suggest they aren't important, of course they are, but that lifelong learning is now an imperative rather than the idea for a few. And so the space that cities can, the kind of role that cities can be playing, the way that all these, sort of different groups that you talked about way in the beginning of, when we started our conversation, about those that are directly engaged in the enterprise of education and those that are outside of it can all be engaged. And if you're kind of creating the places from it, Professor Moreno spoke about that quite a bit, about actually activating and creating those places of convergence. So to respond to your prompt about the Forever Kindergarten, this is actually a lab at MIT, which looks at the way in which in kindergarten, children are sort of learning through doing a great deal. And so the notion of experimentation and discovery that is inherent to all the sort of development, and Helen can talk about the psychology of it, but certainly as a designer, I can tell you that when I'm designing for a 5-year-old in, or a 4-year-old in junior or senior kindergarten, I'm given a certain sort of set of constructs to respond to, versus the moment they get to grade 1, they're expected to sort of sit still and be looking in one direction. So this whole kind of directionality of who's the teacher and how the students are responded sort of often gets baked in. Whereas the notion of Forever Kindergarten is suggesting that that's a concept, the idea that people are all learning at different paces, no matter what their age, and that they can be both self-driven, peer-led, all of these ideas, so that you can actually take them both into the sort of manner in which spaces are created, as well as the way, the education goals are set up and the sort of modalities of education are set up. So what I would say is that, again, if I go back to the sort of research I've been doing over the past year, the reason I sort of went into this research about this post-pandemic campus, to be honest, I started it last April when nobody could think that here we are in February of the following year, still in that same kind of space, more or less. What I really wanted to understand is, here I am as a person who's designed, spaces for learning, truly believing that learning is social, and I still think it is. But, the fact that place had almost been pulled out of the equation. What about it? What changes? And space effectively has become, it hasn't been taken out, of course, it's been distributed, right? And differentiated. So we're all in our own little spaces. We're asking our homes to become everything and all for us. And what we're losing is this kind of creation of a specific place and time, if you will, which is both advantageous because it offers for a kind of diversity of offering, but on the other hand, can also kind of create an undifferentiated experience. So what I would say to you is that we know, even as designers, that both the very formal spaces we create, as well as the spaces in between, the connective tissue, is equally important. So if I could put it in a very simple way, what happens in the classroom is just, what happens outside the classroom is just as important as inside, right? All that sort of space of intermingling. Carlos sort of suggested that also, and others have said that if you can, why does proximity matter? Why is it important to bring this diversity of voices, diversity of experience, this kind of, we were very fond of using the term intellectual collisions a few years ago. This idea that you could actually get, that innovation exists at those seams, if you will, the boundaries between people, boundaries between activities. And I think back to your point, Forever Kindergarten suggests that in a way.
Jason, what does this evoke for you? All this conversation on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so inspired by the work of Carlos, Helen, and Jay, and also what I'm seeing on the channels is so many amazing people. I feel like the whole world is one living learning lab, and every moment, every encounter is an opportunity to learn. I don't think there's a sense of urgency enough from the way we're governing our cities or practicing city making that comes out enough. And I firmly believe that you can read a society's values in its skyline. And I think too often the story I see when I read a skyline is that we value power and wealth and status and not inclusion, equity, beauty. I think there's beauty in the way Berlin tells a story to its youth about the tragedy of its past and how not to make those mistakes again. I think there's beauty in the way Singapore teaches youth how important trees and living systems are to be included in urban environments, so you're not disconnected from nature. So all those things are moments that they're telling something, that kids are sending a message. And I think we're also at the cusp of this really amazing revolution understanding neuroaesthetics and the neuroscience and design, and how profoundly our neurobiology is impacted by the space inside and outside that influences our behaviors and attitudes. There's this notion of cognitive architecture. We are a thigmatic species. We're a wall-hugging species. We like bilateral symmetry. And dare I say, we might, beauty might not always be in the eye of the beholder. But if we design something beautiful, it sends a sense of respect and a sense of endurance to kids, that this is something that's precious and we want to have around for hundreds or more years, right? This is something that we value. Instead of the kind of shape and drape throwaway architecture you see getting built most often in cities. It's sending a message to kids. All those things send signals to kids. How clean the streets are. How much do we value tolerance? How do we name our streets? What kind of public art and statues we put in the public domain? Those are things that are all sending a message about what we value collectively as a species or a society. And too often they're too skewed towards one direction versus the other. So I think that's all really important to put into context. And I think there's so many amazing people like Helen and Jay and Carlos that are working on, we always talk about 8 to 80. Jay just talked about that. If I'm designing something that an 8-year-old can engage to an 80-year-old can engage, we're doing something right. But I've had a particular passion, given my own life journey and relationship, and cities kind of saved my life as a kid, because New York was like this amazing place where I heard like 30 languages on the way to a store, and there's a fusion of culture and tolerance and diversity that I couldn't get in the suburbs, in the monoculture of suburbs. So that city was my teacher, and that taught me about art and diversity and all these things that I wouldn't get in the classroom, and the street smarts and all these things that you learn. But I'm also very focused on teenagers, like the fragility and the neurological development from an adolescent to, say, like that 12 to 18-year-old is a very fragile demographic, and it can go in many different directions. And how well a young adult can express their independence outside of the home and the classroom, that third space that Jay's talking about, and how well we cater to that demographic. So it's not, shunning them away and they're misfits and they're causing trouble, but we're embracing and understanding the age they're at of discovery and boundary setting. And we have places for them to have their independence away and do the things they want to do to go through that tumultuous age of growth that we all have gone through. So I try to always make sure that any urban regeneration project I'm doing, that we have a teenage society thought through. Yes, we have the beautiful learning spaces for kids with moms and dads to be able to have a place to go, but like something different for the teenagers. A skate park, but something else even, that just we're respecting that they need their own space as well. So that's kind of like my little touch point with it. I came into my whole career because of that. I wanted to help solve that little issue.
Could you explain a bit more what you meant by escape parks? I think I know what you're referring to. It's these third spaces for teenagers, right?
Yeah.
Skate parks. Oh, okay, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Skate parks are great for placemaking because it creates, people think skating was such a stigmatized sport, and it's become an acceptable sport now. But they're great placemaking attributes. You put one down, and then dads and sons or daughters and they come and congregate and they skate, and an ice cream shop or a candy shop shows up, and then starts to kind of regenerate a space or a community that might not have had enough center of gravity or destinational attraction for people to come to it. The skate parks too. The Tony Hawk Foundation has been funding these in cities all over the world, and we did it in Seattle, and it changed the nature of the place and helped the local businesses thrive because it created more foot traffic. All these things. There's little interventions. A merry-go-round, in a derelict downtown that was wiped out by a Walmart. You put something in place like that, and then parents and kids come, and because the eyes on the street, it changes a safety factor. It enables businesses to kind of come back to life. There's all these things. I think that all those things tell a story and send a message to kids. That's really important that we understand that as practitioners.
Indeed. Carlos, I want to give you a chance as well to chip into the conversation on this question of space and learning.
This is a very important question, of course, today. In fact, if we consider the current situation in cities with climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, about this interactivity between human and public space, we could say that cities are very fragile, in fact, and we need to propose a new way if we want to develop a interactivity based on citizen and humanistic values. I think that it's not enough to propose only to redesign the public spaces by users and services. In my opinion, we need to propose a new storytelling, a new urban narrative in cities based on the common good for cities. We need to propose the common good as these different resources in cities, including public spaces, including immaterial elements. What is the most important immaterial element in cities today? culture and educations for creating a new urbanities. The new urbanities is this possibility for, at the same time, developing the convergence between a low carbon culture and the new creative culture for using public spaces. For example, the urban agriculture. The urban agriculture is a very powerful leverage for educating kids and teenagers for using differently public spaces. The question is not only to have tomatoes or flowers in the square. This is to practice a common activity for developing the new interactions, not only between the physical spaces and human, but to create these new urbanities based on otherness, solidarity, and a new education. I think that if we want to develop this common good, we need to offer in our quality of responsibles of the as policymakers to offer the possibility for people to submit the projects. One of the powerful leverages in Paris is the participatory budget. Because we have the participatory budget, we have the possibility to offer the means for people to propose the project in the proximity for transforming streets, for transforming squares, for transforming public space. It's not enough to say we need to redesign the public space. We need, in fact, to develop a new culture of the urban labs. During a long time, the urban labs are, in reality, the small spaces, the demonstrators. We needed to develop a new culture for embracing the whole city with this new quality. We needed to transform the public space for biking, for walking. We needed to propose the new activities in the private places, in the restaurants, in the bars, in the cafes. We have the possibility to open each one of the square meters for offering these new kinds of interaction. I think that the key element is a coherent new urban policy. If we need to propose a new path based on a urban policy, the new urbanities, the new responsibilities for each one, and to use, in fact, the public space as a tool for transforming our mindset. This is the most important point today. We have 10 years for transforming the mindset if we wanted to reach the carbon neutrality at the horizon 2050. This is the target.
Thank you, Carlos. I want us to come to the question on how we do this, the whole question around participatory methods, community involvement, and everything else. But I do want to read a question to you guys from Peyman Bonori. Simple, very simple question. By introducing academic subjects within mundane settings, such as supermarkets, don't you feel that we might actually be turning off children from more formal academic learning? Interesting question. If we're making learning outside of school cool, to put it, very simply, what happens next? Any of you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I'll just, I saw that question and thank you for that question. I think it's a great one. I think the ultimate goal and what we're trying to do is trying to sort of take away this false dichotomy between play and learning. So in our concepts for playful learning landscapes, what we're trying to do is, embed sort of these playful learning opportunities. So children don't see it. We don't see it as academic learning versus other learning, right? Like we're trying to spark conversation between caregivers and children, and that we know leads to better outcomes, their learning trajectory. But but I don't think children, the sort of secret spice is that children don't see it as what, that they're, learning about numbers and colors. They're just talking. They're talking, the parents are asking them, caretakers are asking them questions, and they're responding, and they're making it just more engaging, fun experience. So I think that, ideally what we're wanting to see is having, the whole concept of playful learning is really play is the way that, children are engaging with the world at whatever age they are. Like this whole concept of lifelong kindergarten, I agree with completely that, we really need to see learning in different contexts. And this is just a way to, take advantage of this, a lot of time that children are spending out of school in their community, with their families, with their peers, and so forth. And so that's just a comment on that question.
Jason, maybe?
Yeah, I think it is in fact a great question. I think that in some ways, this current moment where we're looking at this sort of global experiment where all of a sudden everybody's doing virtual learning, and for the kids at the moment, everything's sort of been turned into a classroom that they're either signing into, synchronous, asynchronous. We can get into the details of that. But what is really coming out after almost a year of this is that there is so much other learning that occurs that is not being measured, right? So when we say that, is it acceptable to take learning outside of those kind of formal settings, there's an enormous amount of learning that's going on in the spaces in between, as I mentioned, but also kind of developing the mindsets of curiosity, of discovery, of interaction, of collaboration, of knowing one's own learning style, if you will, when it is that one recedes versus one engages. So there are all these kinds of things that we've actually taken for granted quite a bit. And so when we talk about when is that learning occurring, or when we have, articles that talk about learning loss over summers, over the summer because the kids are not sort of in school in a particular environment, for instance, long before the pandemic. So I think what I'm trying to say is that the learning imperative now has a different viewpoint that is saying to us that there's all kinds of social cultural learning, but also the kinds of mindsets that allows even a more technical understanding, So I'll give you an example. One of the sort of students that I spoke to about the difference between being in a lecture hall versus being outside, she was studying organic chemistry. I mean, God bless her. But she actually mentioned to me that watching her professor write those very long sort of carbon molecules actually helped her understanding versus being able to see it finally written down in a slide, right? So if you're sort of seeing a final slide. So what I'm getting at is that there's all kinds of unconscious learning that we're all doing all the time that now is getting a different lens on it because a lot of it has sort of moved out. And some of the conversation, I know the loudest conversation is around equity, around access to technology and such. But you know what we're also missing is something that a Professor Dieter Breithacker, I hope I said his name right, will talk to you about just movement, the importance of movement in the sort of the physiological importance of movement and even micro movement in allowing us to have the mindset for learning. So what I'd say is if we're on the move, we're probably learning better. It's a very sort of big oversimplification, if you will, but it is something to think about.
Jason? Is this
It's fascinating. I mean, I'm kind of with Helen and Jay on this. We're all snowflakes. We're all a little bit different in how we learn and respond. And I think I'm a father of two young boys, and I've always been struggling how to nurture curiosity in them, and a passion for learning, or a desire to learn, or be curious to learn something more, which Jay was just bringing up. And there's a notion of how you learn, or children learn, through the behavior of those around them, right? So having mentors around them, this is stuff that you can, it's not only going to happen in the classroom, it has to happen at the home and in the community, the third places. But I've always noticed that when I'm playing music, my boys tend to want to play music. Or if I'm exercising, going to the gym, all of a sudden my boys want to go to exercise and go to the gym. If my wife is doing painting or drawing, all of a sudden my boys are interested in art. So there's something about the learner behavior that's in the home and the community around them with their peers that's really important. So it's also focusing on the parents and how we're always developing. I'm a lifetime learner, so how we're developing ourselves as parents, you know, and being part of that whole community with the school, I think is crucial. And having other mentors in the kid's life is crucial. I mean, we lived in Sydney, we lived in this really great human scale, old heritage urban community called Balmain. And it was literally like a movable feast. Like the good and bad and ugly of life was on the doorstep every day. There were drunk people walking around, and kids would see the behavior of adults in that way. They would see people supporting the elderly in our community when we had extreme heat, and how we had to come to the community, you know, that we were very involved in our community. We're doing service in the community where we know the names of our retail stores and the butcher and the baker. Because it was a tight-knit community, because of the scale of development, and it was pre-car, so it was very compressed urbanism. So, I mean, the sidewalks were like, everything was really easy to walk and get to. That whole system created a learning lab for kids. And because of that, those kids were free range. There was a safety factor, enough eyes on the street that those kids can go play all day long without parents being around. They had places to go on their own. And there's something in that the system of how we create urban environments that enables that. Right now, that whole study we talked about last time, you know, I think it was, we used to be able to walk 7 miles from home back in the 70s. I mean, just because of the sensationalism of kidnapping and news and fear mongering in the news, you know, you can barely go like 100 meters from your house now. It's like, oh, parents get worried. And that's all in the psychology of how we think about, because of all the negative news that comes out. There's so many factors that play a role in that, in the parent dynamic with kids and the teacher's dynamic with kids, that all has to be thought about. And you know, how we transform our city, what Carlos is doing, that 15-minute city, that is tantamount. That's like the canvas you have to start from. And then you can layer in a lot of other stuff that we're talking about. But I think all of it comes from a whole system change and a mindset shift in how we think about cities and how we govern our cities.
Interesting. I'd like for us to take a little segue into the conversation around digital space. We've been talking a lot about the physical space. And I guess for me, with two kind of underlying questions here, you know, there's lots of talk around AI, virtual reality, augmented reality. Would you feel in your work, in your experiences, that these technologies should be better leveraged as learning opportunities in the city space? And I also like to ask a question around smart cities, and maybe here, maybe more to you, Carlos, is that, you know, I've been following the smart cities conversation for quite a while, but it seems to me that learning and education are not necessarily an objective of these smart cities project. It's about efficiency, it's about energy flows, mobility flows, flows of the good and things like that. But that learning, improving the learning outcomes of citizens is not necessarily at the heart. How do you react to that?
Yes, in fact, in my experience, the digital technologies and cities for developing creativity, curiosity, we need to evoke different aspects. In my research work, I have identified this term, the zombie geek. This is one of the ways for developing technologies in cities. Zombie geeks are people full connected by hyper technologies and full socially disconnected. We need to avoid to generate the people as zombie geek, because we have this danger to isolated people in the bubble with new technologies, virtual reality, digital games, social networks that in reality are not a social network by as individual networks. I think that it is very important to develop, in my opinion, this concept of hybridization. We need to develop the social hybridization with from the new technologies with the real life. What is, in my opinion, the path for that? Proximity is, for me, a very important element. I was born in South America. I was born in Colombia. And in Latin America, for example, the education, this is very, very different as the education in Europe. The education in Latin America, in general, is selected by money. In fact, private schools in Europe, in France, the school is totally free, open, etc. And new technologies are common for poor people and rich people. We need to propose a collaborative activities based on this hybridization. A very concrete example, when I had the opportunity for working with teenagers in Latin America, the possibility to use digital technologies, for example, for developing mapping. The mapping, this is a possibility for sharing the real stories by digital technologies in the physical spaces, the wall, the street. We have the possibility to propose a new hybrid space for sharing with the digital technologies the real stories. The danger is when we could escape of the reality only in the bubble of new technologies. And we need to, for that, we need to create the new spaces. I think that in the informal education, it is necessary to create new habits for people. Each one of the spaces and times for creating the real histories, the heritage, for example. We have the possibility to develop this hybridization with my heritage, with my street, the fountain, the sport activities, food. In fact, we need to invoke the real reality before to develop the virtual reality. This is the surname real reality because I oppose to virtual reality. The 15-minute city, the proximity, this is a new way for developing this hybridization in my district, with the informal education for creating in the different concrete spaces the new urban stories.
Thank you, Carlos. I was keeping one question on how do we make this happen on the question of collaboration, but I see many questions appearing in the chat relating to that. So indeed, I mean, I think there's great enthusiasm in the audience around what we're talking around, you know, promoting learning cities, creating these new learning spaces, making them inclusive and equitable. I guess the question coming out is, this is great, how do we make it happen? So maybe turn to the four of you on, you know, you've been working on this for a long time. What do you think is, I was about to say recipe, there is no one recipe, but what's the kind of, you know, do's and don'ts, the kind of toolbox to turning this concept of learning cities and learning spaces into reality? I don't know if any of you want to jump into this question first.
I'll go. I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that Jason and Carlos said just a little while ago. Jason, when I lived in New York City, I used to call it Bombay with an accent. I grew up in Bombay, and the two cities could not be more different in certain ways, but they had a real similarity in terms of, you know, jostling people together, and this notion that there was anything sort of possible. What it also meant is that, you know, at a very sort of at an important age of, you know, of learning in early professions, I also got exposed to inordinate inequity. Both of these cities have inordinate inequities. And a lot of the sort of questions that are also coming through talk about how do you recognize the fact that cities are very complex? And you already sort of said that, Sebastian. There's not one way of doing this. So if we accept the fact that things might be community generated, that we take a much more nuanced look at the types of systems and spaces and formal and informal networks, almost a constellation, if you will, both of organizations, but also of spaces and activities that can support it. If there isn't a sort of a more simplistic idea, then I think we sort of start with the right mindset, if you will. So even the sort of, the discussion around the digital divide, dare we hope that we can get to a place where sort of high-speed broadband is really infrastructure for cities and not, who has it, who doesn't, in the same way that, well, I mean, there are certainly many places in the world that are still struggling with power or clean water. But if we saw it at that sort of same level, and in the same manner that we were saying earlier, that city planning does not need to sort of segregate, the kind of colored zoning diagrams that say you sleep here and you walk here and you play there and here are my different color pencils to tell you where you do what, but really that they're all merging in that same manner. Learning is merging too. So I can tell you that as a campus architect, for instance, there used to be, if you looked at the way the campuses used to be planned, there was this sort of distinction that the students kind of had dorms over here and they had, amenity spaces where they went and, ate here, and then you have, you learned somewhere else, and there was a sort of a similar kind of planning modality, if you will. But if you actually see the way students learn today, it's all happening all at the same time. And you can kind of see that both of those scenarios need to be planned for and made possible. And back to what we were saying. So one, the city has to be willing to create, permit, both from a policy standpoint and a resource allocation standpoint to permit those things to happen. Years ago, I was involved in a public, a citizen-led activation in New York City, where we went and looked at all the public plazas that had been allowed. So they were actually within private spaces. So they were often office towers, condo towers that had received certain development rights in exchange for creating public plazas at their base, for instance. And the thing that we were doing was going forward and saying, well, were they successful? Did that policy work? That was the work that was being done. And this brings me back to something I said about boundaries, right? In many of those places, they didn't feel like they were public spaces. The perception for somebody who was walking around, even in a city like New York, was that this is private space, I am not welcome here, and they certainly weren't activated. So they weren't actually bringing people together. So when we start thinking about that, when we think about porosity, both in terms of physical porosity, but also in terms of planning porosity, about planning programs, right? So Carlos was speaking earlier about, schools. Schools have frequently been that place. In many, many cities, it is understood that the sort of primary purpose of education occurs in certain hours, but they actually, pretty much turn into community centers, if you will. And again, some places do it better than others, right? So universities can start doing the same thing. Certainly, we've seen that these formal educational structures can become the players, but they're not the only players. And so a lot of it is actually coming from citizen groups as well. And what I'm really hoping is going to, one of the positives that I hope will come out of this strange experiment we've all lived in is that we will start seeing our city different. I mean, our streets differently, right? Once you sort of give away from saying that the car is the dimension for the city and its perception, and we start looking at, the human being, the pace of movement, whether at the pace of a pedestrian or a cyclist, and you start seeing all these interventions that have taken place across the world of, restaurants coming out onto the streets, little parks, if you will. Will they stay? There we hope. I mean, I think there's a lot of cities that are saying, how can we keep them going, right? So I think that's when you start seeing, a better activation. There's a whole group called Tactical Urbanism that starts looking at all these different interventions. Again, that are citizen-led, and hopefully, they're experimental. That's the other thing, is to kind of stay in the space of experiment and to see what works for you, and then to change it along the way. So the agility needs to be there too.
Talking about experiments, I guess, good segue to for me towards Helen, and we're actually getting lots of questions, Helen, on the playful learning landscapes. I mean, I would suppose that these projects you've developed involve urban planners, city planners, heads of leisure and parks and recreation, neurosciences. I mean, how did this happen? Was it difficult? What were kind of the underlying factors that made it a success, according to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just spotlight two examples as I was listening to Jay's wonderful comments. So right now, at least in the United States, we have Philadelphia, that's sort of known as the model playful learning landscape city. And why is that? That's because there's sort of three. I think there's sort of have this trifecta to the success. One is the research coming from Temple University, right? So you have a university player research. These are hardcore developmental researchers that are typically just looking at behaviors in the lab, right? And now they've taken that to say like, well, what can we see like in real life in a city, in a public space? So just to acknowledge that, like I also child developmental psychology background, to be in a conversation like this is like nothing that I would have ever dreamed of. I think, when I was coming out of graduate school thinking, oh, I'm going to work with urban planners and architects and designers and people, creating cities. That's kind of a crazy, crazy notion. And so, for Philadelphia, you have Temple, you have the support at a city level, right? So the mayor on down has been supportive, trying to make, Philadelphia a playful city, one that, again, is good for children and older generation and everybody in between. So you have, city level support, including, again, the city agencies, Parks and Rec, transportation, planning, the health department. All these departments have come together to realize, like, if we want to make a better city, we want to embed some playful learning and make it beautiful and enjoyable and vibrant for everybody. And you have, the philanthropy, right? You have a foundation, you have the William Penn Foundation that has supported playful learning landscapes, I think, from day one. So you have sort of those three factors that have come together to say, this is what we want for our city and this is what we're envisioning. And then an international example. So Brookings recently launched what we call the Playful Learning Landscape City Network. So this is trying to create a network of cities that are thinking about more play and playful learning in their cities. Right now, it's quite small. We've started with 3 US cities: Chicago, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. These are all pretty forward-thinking cities that are further along in their processes and journey in terms of embedding play and playful learning into the public realm. And then we have Tel Aviv as a wonderful example of a city outside the US that has really done a lot in terms of supporting families and children. And so for Tel Aviv has a very interesting model. The municipality of Tel Aviv-Yafo has a municipal employee that sits within the Department of Community Planning and Development, who works across the city agencies as sort of a champion of early childhood. Right. So in the beginning of this project, they had to spend quite a lot of time building political will to make it clear to the head of parks and gardens or transportation or health that, yeah, early childhood has some, there's some importance to your role. And so they did this partially by bringing all of the municipal leaders to Copenhagen to say, look, this is what it could look like in your city, to showcase how play can be infused into the public realm. And so that sort of sparked ideas and conversation. And so from there, now it's sort of like across the city agencies, they are now thinking about early childhood and supporting families and children, I think, of all ages in different ways, and changing many of their public spaces.
And I love that. Let's all go to Copenhagen. Let's all go on a learning expedition to Copenhagen to discover what it is. Jason, you've been at the heart, same thing, of lots of urban development projects, regenerative urbanism. I mean, what do you feel is really essential in transforming this vision of learning cities into reality? And I guess it links into your current project in Doha with Qatar Foundation right now.
It does. And I've been scanning all the different queries on the chat channel and just listening in. And there's 3 things that I think are really fundamental. And first, we have to recognize that we have a crisis of equity in our cities. and a right to the city. And a lot of our population falls through the cracks and doesn't have access to a lot of what we're talking about. So there needs to be a foundation in place that enables the right and equitable, inclusive city to happen. And that's progressive governance, and that's changing the nature of humans' relationship to land. I think the fundamental flaw of modern humanity is that we commoditize land. And as soon as we privatize and commoditize what's beneath our feet, we beget social inequity and environmental degradation. So that is a systems issue that we have to deal with before we get to this layer of how we do learning cities. That's a crucial element. There's a really amazing movement happening called Community Wealth Building, led by the Democracy Collaborative in the UK, and a really cool group Democracy Collaborative in the US, in Cleveland, DC, and a group in the UK. That's really fundamentally changing the equity structure of cities by having communities really start to take hold of, ground space in their city, or banking institutions, or food cooperatives. So it's much more of a citizen-led way of shaping a place and making it more equitable and giving more people, local people, opportunity. Because right now you have this global real estate industry with capital that's anonymous. It's not really associated with place. It's just numbers dropping into our city, putting placeless, shape and drape glass towers everywhere. And cities are losing a sense of identity. Right, and you heard me talk about this concept of solastalgia, and I noticed there's someone from Australia on here. There's an amazing philosopher named Glenn Albrecht who came up with this concept called solastalgia, which is the opposite of nostalgia. But you have a sense of homesickness or a sense of loss from your home, even though you haven't moved because your environment's changing so rapidly around you, right? And we're not really an urban species. This is still an experiment for us to live in such high concentrated areas of population density, given our 200,000 year history as a species on the planet. So it's a new phenomenon for us. So the psychology of living in dense urban environments is one thing as well we have to look at. The next one is I see smart and human-centric all the time. I prefer to use.
Is that good or bad?
What's that?
Is that good or bad?
I think it's smart washing a lot right now. I think we have to move beyond that to look at wise cities. No pun intended with wise, but dialogue.
Thank you very much.
Like the urban transformation dialogue we're talking to talk about in Qatar is this wise city and the culturally driven, not technically driven. Technology has a role to play, an appropriate application of it, but it has to come from the culture of place and people and land. So Musharraf is one of our developments in downtown Doha, which people might be able to visit during the World Cup or in the region now the blockade's done. And that is something that speaks to the culture and architectural vernacular of Islam, of this faith, Arabian virtues and values that kind of manifests itself in the built environment. And that whole precinct tells a story about the value of place and what it means to have a non-franchise ground plane, local businesses, and like the story it tells. So there's something really important about that, about the cultural derived city, I think is really important. And I prefer to use life-centric as opposed to human-centric because we're so anthropocentric and doing it for humans, we're forgetting about that we're one of many living species. And I want to hear, birds chirping in the trees above me. I want to make sure that the bees can pollinate the flowers down the streets. Like if we're not designing for the birds and the bees and everything else in our cities, you're losing an opportunity to teach kids about nature, that it's not something separate from. Everything in our cities is from nature. I learned that from Ann Weston Spurn, who taught it, I think, MIT, in the language of landscape. That it's a manifestation of how we've created it, but everything around us is from nature. And the third one is regenerative education. And knowing that much of our educational system is Western-derived curriculum. And there's so much to learn from the ancient cultures of the world. A lot of what I've learned in my adult life from like 25 on has been unlearning what I was taught in school and what I was taught growing up in a Republican family in the East Coast of the United States who voted for Trump. It's like, how do I unlearn from that experience as a kid? And I've been mentored by First Peoples in North America, Aboriginal Australians, and Maori. And I've been completely had my life shifted, my perception of the world shifted because of that. So I think there's something to really think about how we look at de-Westernizing a bit of our educational curriculum and systems and look at learning from other cultures and how they play a role in teaching kids about the differences between, STEM education versus cultural learnings about place and being a good custodian of life on this planet. So there's something in there, I think, there's an emergence coming, and there's a whole strategy we're looking at where regenerative education, I think, is the beginning of a dialogue of how we can reconcile different cultural learnings that change the way we educate children. And cities tell that story.
And thanks for that, Jason, because there were indeed lots of questions as well around regenerative education, around placing nature at the heart of cities. Carlos, I'd like to turn to you, because same thing, I know there's lots of talk these days around the 15-minute city concept. Something tells me people will tell you easier said than done. What's your take on this idea of transforming our cities and turning them into 15-minute cities in which learning is at the heart of everything we do within these 15 minutes? What's your take, and what's your experience maybe with Paris, for example?
Yeah. Sebastian, I said to my students in general, to learn is more complex than to be a teacher and to be a student. Because before all, we have been becoming the citizen dwellers in a urban culture. And it is not possible to educate people without to before identify where and how we are living. The social conditions for living in cities are very different for students. We need for that to precise a new pedagogical approach based on this holistic vision. The proximity is very important for us today. For example, in the city of Paris, the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, she said, the school is the capital of my district. The school is the capital of my neighborhood, because it's not possible only to consider my daily life as a student inside my school and another different life when I am in a home or in my street. We are living in a continuity in the public space, in my house, in my building, and when I am in the school. The question is that today we need to understand this urban culture. In Paris, for that, we have been creating a new place, Tumo, at the heart of Paris. Tumo, this is a very good experience for the educational activities born in Estonia, in Tallinn. Tumo, this is a new holistic center, totally free, for allowing the possibility for kids, for teenagers, to be educated with digital technologies in a urban environment, with the possibility to apply for the real life, for developing a new culture based on sustainability to now the different threats, climate change, at the same time, the citizen commitment. In fact, I consider that proximity today in cities, this is the possibility to mix new technologies, social activities, intergenerational approach, and to develop the actions for pedagogical spread gender equity. The role of the public space is very, very important, because in reality, it's not at the school, it's not only at home. This is in the public space, the places where we have the possibility to transmit really the humanistic and the holistic values. We need today to spread another urban culture. Today, we are threatened by a mainstream of ignorance, of unknowledge. We needed to, before to develop the mathematics, the complex mathematics or the chemistry formulas, we needed to share with people the values of the humanity, democracy, to fight against violence, to develop otherness, to fight against populism, to develop the cooperative activities, to use technologies for common good, and to invoke the universal values of humanity if we wanted to generate a new generations for building a new urban culture without violence and indeed useful, not only useful for us, useful for communities, nature, and our well-being in cities. And this case, of course, to learn is in all moments and all places. We need to develop this culture of the automatically to be in a learning position, in a learning attitude in everywhere, every time.
Thank you, Carlos. I see that time has flown by. This has been amazing. We have a few minutes left, and I maybe invite, Carlos has inspired us, I think, with his last intervention, but maybe Jay, Helen, Jason, quickly in a minute or two, any last thought, last ideas, last passion you'd like to share with our audience before we go?
I just want to bring out some of the sort of themes that have, kind of come through in our conversation, which I hope we will continue to explore, in the days, months, years to come. One of the important words I think that I'm hearing over and over, and which I genuinely believe in, is the notion of multiplicity, and the idea that one size does not fit all. It's not either or, but it's more like both and. And if we can take that kind of framework, back to the notion of citizen participation, to remember that what that does is it actually empowers people, and the kind of learning that occurs through the generation of things that are important to particular communities, knowing that those resources are available to make them come to fruition, is incredibly empowering. It creates for a very different city when neighborhoods or streets, even regions, start to have that sense of empowerment and engagement within the public realm. And again, this idea of what the public realm is incredibly important. And we're all having this conversation when we're all very much isolated. And I really do hope that, once it is safe enough to do so, we will sort of emerge from it, from this kind of greater consciousness, if we will, about the value of being able to come together, to be able to have this kind of debate, because it isn't really possible to appreciate the other, whatever the other means to any one of us in our sort of singular kind of experiences, without having that. And so I think that aspect of education, where one is growing and learning because one's horizons are expanding, is so exceptional within the context of a city and a region, and any kind of way that can be promoted. And then finally, I would just sort of add to that I can't believe we've had a conversation on cities without talking about transit, but I dare say that that's going to be, yet another conversation, but
yes,
definitely an important element in being able to understand how to be interconnected. So thank you again for inviting me to this. It's been delightful.
Indeed. Jason, last words?
I just think of cities as never-ending stories, and a new chapter always being written. It needs to be written with youth in mind and kids' voices in mind. But may we not lose the plot of the past, and may it inform our future. And may we never stop learning at any age.
Thank you for that, Jason. Helen?
Yeah, just to build on those great words from Jay and Jason and Carlos, I think a theme for me that's come out is sort of this multi-generational, and thinking about, I think in this, especially in the pandemic time, we've realized like how critical our relationships are with our older, our younger, everybody in the middle, our teens. These relationships that's the foundation for learning. And so being able to promote deeper relationships through public spaces and through playful learning, I think is something that I'm inspired by for this work.
Thank you for that. Before we leave, in the preparation of this panel with Jason, Carlos, Jay, and Helen, we were discussing some kind of, must-read books around urbanism and urban planning. And I'm saying this because I know with WISE, we have mostly an audience of educators. So just wanted to recommend a few authors and books. Of course, there's Jane Jacob. Any book or any book about or by Jane Jacobs a must-read in terms of the future of cities and quality of life. In terms of placemaking, the Project for Public Spaces, How to Turn a Place Around. If you're interested in transforming your neighborhoods, very interesting read. And I believe Jason and I are both fans of the 99% Invisible City podcast, and they've just released a book. Amazing stories on our bridges, our buildings, our glasses, our potholes, our fire hydrants. So a lot to learn on our cities. On this note, I'd like to thank the team, Aurelio, Farah, Basim, Amina, Aisha, who have made this session possible. I'd like to thank our speakers, indeed, Helen, Jay, Jason, Carlos, thank you very much again. And to you, our audience, you've been great. I mean, there's been so many comments and so many exchanges. People are exchanging emails and WhatsApp numbers. So apparently we're onto something with this conversation, and we hope to be able to continue it in the future iterations of the WISE Learning Ecosystems Living Lab conversations, whether in print, in panels, or whatnot, and hopefully, inshallah, soon physically together. And so on this, right on time, it's 11:31 in Montreal. I will say thank you to all. Enjoy the rest of the week, enjoy the rest of the day, and see you all soon. Thank you, Basim. I think we're wrapped.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Wow, that was great. Thank you.
I think we're still live, so we'll reconnect.